which is an event, that continues to honor the memory of a very brilliant economist and also a deeply thoughtful human being. His full name is Bhaskar Gopalakrishna Kumar. Many people who know him very closely, they remember him as Gopu Kumar. Between 1990 and 93, Gopu was an associate professor, associate fellow at that time it was called, at the CDS. And during that time, though his service here was very brief, his contribution left a lasting mark on the institution and all who had a privilege of knowing him. He was educated in various places, Geneva, Kolkata, Delhi, Leeds, Oxford, and he studied with Professor Amartya Sen, and his scholarship reflected both depth and compassion. His research spanned the Kerala model of development, agriculture, price setting, population studies, health, and each driven by justice, human welfare, and the complexity of India's development experience. I take this opportunity to thank Gobu's family for establishing this endowment, which makes it possible for us to organize this lecture every year. And since 1995, when we started this lecture, that time Professor Amartya Sen delivered the inaugural lecture. After that, a number of economists and social scientists, they have delivered lectures. Some of the names include Geeta Sen, Pranab Bardhan, Maitresh Kadak, Sonalde Desai, Francis Stewart, Kunal Sen, Karthik Muralidharan, and last year, Soumya Swaminathan. And this year, we are very honored to have with us Professor Barbara Harris-White, Emeritus Professor of Development Studies at Oxford University, to deliver this 2025 lecture on the theme, which is very important and very close to Gobu's heart, different approaches to informality. Professor Harris-White is a very well-known name. All of us know her. She's a very distinguished scholar of India's political economy. Over 5 decades, her work has transformed our understanding of agrarian change, rural markets, informal capitalism, and social inequality. Through long-term field research across South Asia, she has illuminated how economic life is shaped by caste, gender, and class, and how informal economies both sustain and contest power. She has supervised over 40 doctoral students and as many postdoctoral researchers and authored and co-edited more than 40 books and published hundreds of papers and chapters in reputed journals. Beyond her research, she has been a major institution builder, serving as director of Queen Elizabeth House and founding both Oxford's MPhil in Development Studies and its contemporary South Asian Studies program. Her lecture today is titled as Different Approach to Informality. It promises to offer a fresh insight into how informal economic activity operates, not simply as a marginal or unregulated space, but as a field shaped by the politics of selective enforcement and compliance. Drawing on her extensive field work, the lecture will explore the pervasive and complex nature of India's informal economy. I extend a warm welcome to Professor Barbara Harris-White. I also welcome Gobu's family, if any of them are here. And anyway, they expressed their best wishes for the event, some of them. And also welcome faculty members, students, and staff of CDS, and all others who have joined us to celebrate Gobu's life and intellectual legacy. Please join me again inviting Professor Barbara Harris to deliver the 16th B.G. Kumar Memorial Lecture. How do you like it? Yeah, awesome.
Before I start to give this lecture, in memory of somebody I knew who I greatly admired as a young creative researcher in Oxford, I would like to present a book to CDS in gratitude for their generosity over the years and today. So I'm sorry about West Bengal. Please take it out.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please take it out.
Gold.
It's about India's gold. India has 5 times more gold than Fort Knox.
Thank you so much.
Okay, this one?
Yes,
Right.
right.
Hello, everybody again. It's a huge pleasure and a privilege to deliver this lecture. And I'm looking forward enormously to feedback, because as I give this lecture, you will understand just how provisional it is. But I'm very grateful to have this moment to air these ideas with an audience that both distinguished and about to be distinguished, the young people. Yes, I knew Gopu. He was a postdoc, I think, when I arrived in Oxford in 1987. And what Professor Vilmani said about him is very true, that he had a wide range of interests, and he was always interested in humanizing development as an economist. So he was engaged in the cracks between economics and other disciplines in the search of better ways to achieve development. And it's in the memory of somebody who had those values that I give this lecture. So there are 4 parts to it. I would outline them now and then talk about them. Many of you are expert in the informal economy. You well know what it consists of, but because I want to build on an established base of knowledge, I will very quickly, in the first part, explain the theoretical histories of informality and the state's own concepts, which are tremendously important in the empirical work that is done. And I'm going to argue about the persistence of dualities, which have led us to think about informality in one particular way. And I want to explode that duality in this talk. And that will develop into a hypothesis about actually existing capitalism in India being ordered, not chaotic, through the selective enforcement on the side of the state of regulative law. And the selective incentives that I have in society or in the economy, either to adhere voluntarily or to comply for fear of punishment. So incentives to enforce are coming up with incentives to comply. And I want to explore the implications for method. It's not a dry question. It's how we know, what we know. And I am going to talk about the problems of reinterpreting case material, which was never collected to answer this question. So it's reading between the lines. And also how I have used AI, artificial intelligence, as a research assistant in a quite open experiment. So part 2 is the AI result, looking at informality at and outside the frontiers of laws of regulation of the economy. And I then go in part 3 to look at case study material from, as it happens, my own fieldwork. And then the 4th part tries to bring some provisional conclusions together as hypotheses for further research or for debunking. You can all say this is rubbish, I'll go home. Okay, so the first part, for some people, this is 101, this is very familiar. The concept of the informal economy is due to an anthropologist called Keith Hart, who was working on a tribe called the Frafra in Ghana in the late 1960s. And he saw that a lot of activity was small scale, criminal, nighttime, fleeting, seasonal, flexible. And he invented this term, the informal economy, which was taken up by the International Labour Office in their subsequent study of Kenya the next year. So 1973, it went to Kenya. So that was the original theorization, that it was temporary, that it was survivalist, it was poor people somehow making do. After a while, Caroline Moser and Castells and Portis developed another kind of theory about the informal economy, that it was certainly not going to be temporary, that it was permanent, and that it served a function, that the informal economy was essential for the registered formal economy, and that it was also dynamic, it had momentum. It was permanent, but that firms in particular were deliberately selecting to act in the informal economy in order to escape state regulation, in particular to escape tax, which is a very permanent incentive. About a decade later, Hernando de Soto came up with a legalist theory, which was that the informal economy was the nesting place of people, of enterprises with very insecure, poor property rights. And that had a very strong policy implication, which was make property rights firm, and then the formal economy will result and everybody will be more productive. So that has been enduringly influential. By the 21st century, Marty Chen, I think it was, who first put into theoretical generalized terms the idea that the informal economy existed inside very large registered formal organized entities. So she was looking at the consequences of the new managerial theories and the theories of neoliberalism for privatization and casualization inside the state bureaucracy and inside the corporate economy and public sector activity. So again, she had a theory that this is permanent. As long as one has privatization, casualization, this will be permanent, and that labor is precaritized. And we now have a very big field in labor economics, which is investigating the gig economy as a case in point. Although never let us forget that although that's a lot of livelihoods in absolute terms, it's still only about 2% of India's workforce. At the same time, coming from a completely different direction, were a whole host, a bundle of theories about new public management and the commodification of the state, that is the penetration of capitalist commodification inside state bureaucracies, and that privatization involved informalization and also with great threats to democracy, even in its limited electoral form. And there were theories of market-driven politics, which, once you looked at the small print, include informal and criminal politics. Asim Prakash, looking at India, started to talk about hybrid institutions and practices. In other words, things that we think about separately, like state, civil society, market, they're useful to think with, but in practice, they tend to be meshed, and we need a vocabulary. So Lucia Micheluti, because she's Italian, has invoked an Italian word, intreccio, for the same phenomenon, the meshing of institutions in practice that we think about separately. And so we come to post-colonial political economy, Kalyan Sanyal, Partha Chatterjee, and the legacy in the present. And how is all this post-colonial studies relevant to the informal economy? Because in an attempt to develop anti-Eurocentric, anti-universalist theory, which is relevant to the South, for which read India, the informal economy is both the result and the victim of a process of grabbing of resources, which Marxists call primary or primitive accumulation, and which Sanyal and co. are arguing persists into the present. They aren't the first to argue this. In fact, some of the people they criticize of Eurocentricity have argued this for quite some time. Anyway, the point is that, yet again, Sanyal theorizes the economy into two sections. One is the accumulation economy, and the other is the need economy. And he calls the need economy the informal economy. Okay, but he also says it's a subsistence economy. It's poor people, it's peasants, artisans, and petty production in the informal sector, I quote, and disposable people, I quote, ancient forms and wasteland. Okay. So let us turn from the 101 of theory, which I hope is building up a kind of model of duality in your minds, to how the Indian state itself conceptualizes the informal economy. And the reason this is important is that A, it's very rarely linked to the theory, and B, if you want to test the theory with data, you have to use the state's categories. So what we learn if we start looking at the state's own categories is that any proxy for informality has come a long time after the state has already labeled bits of the economy as the opposite of informal, okay? So the first idea to emerge was the unorganized sector. It's the bit which is not state regulated for work rights or for social security. And it's firms with under 10 laborers. And the National Sample Survey introduced this concept in 1972. But let's remember that the organized sector was developed for the purpose of the politics of provident funds in the 1950s. So much earlier, that concept had official recognition, and its opposite, the unorganized sector, lagged by about 20 years. The next to be developed was own account enterprise with no hired labor. We find the economic census using that in 1977. The third, unprotected, labor without work rights or social security rights, even though, as I was saying earlier this afternoon, if I'm an employer with fewer than 5 laborers, I count as labor. So 95% of firms in India count as labor under these laws. The NSS started using that in 1999. Then there's something which is not a binary and it's not a duality. The concept of small industry, well, originally small industry and not small industry, but over time, micro, small and medium industry, a trio. And although those words have been used for quite a long time, it wasn't until the MSME Act in 2006 that got officially shrined in data. And lastly, unincorporated, whereas incorporated was something that the British used at the end of the 19th century in the first version of the Companies Act. Unincorporated wasn't actually used as a category for data collection until 2021. Okay, so you have a history of different words and concepts being used by the Indian state to provide us with data. So we do have a love affair with duality and with binaries. And in the top part of the slide, I've simply listed what I've talked about already. And the concept of formal and informal is something that I know that NCEUS used, but the state has rather been, if you look at the whole set of state reports, the state seems a bit reluctant to use that term. It's used as an umbrella term, and it refers to all activity which isn't registered or regulated, and that's what I'm going to talk about, or taxed or protected. So in a way, it's a residual term, but it covers a lot of different ways to cut the economy. It covers firms, it refers to the whole economy or a sector or a certain kind of activity or labor. And it appropriates and conflates the official categories. Of late, we have the new concept of nano. Nano is starting to appear not just colloquially in newspapers, but in government reports. First for technology, obviously, but now for entrepreneurs. So as far as I'm concerned, if you take away one thing, you take away the blind men feeling the elephant, that informality is not a question of binaries and duality. It's also a question of different people with different perspectives coming to the conclusion that it's different things, unprotected, unorganized, unincorporated, and so on. Now, if we say, let us abandon those binaries, where can we go for some security? So we have distinguished teachers of institutions in the audience, but what I have found useful to think with is the idea that where the state either doesn't or won't regulate, then non-state institutions fill the vacuum, or at least they were always there. They were always there. There was never a vacuum. And they are reworked to have regulative force in the economy. This idea of institutions means that institutions are not a thing. They are a site of political agency, of forms of social authority, and of dynamic conflicts. And the ones that we've been talking about in meetings with students today include class, religion, caste, ethnicity, gender, and so on. But we mustn't forget organizations like caste associations, which have now been mutating or morphing or developing into guilds, which regulate the economy outside, and chambers of commerce, which regulate the economy outside the reach of the state. The thing about all these institutions, which are being reworked to have regulative heft, is that we don't know about them from official statistics. It has huge implications for research method. We have to go out and find for ourselves. But when we go out, what we find is that the unit of organization and the unit of accountability is generally local and even quite intimate and very different from the idea of the Indian nation as a national economic market, an e-market, whatever you like. The nation is a huge unit. The actually existing units of regulation are in a balance of different kinds in different parts of India. So the social structure of accumulation school, which comes out of Amherst in the States, sorry. Makes a further huge leap of theoretical reasoning and suggests that all these institutions actually stabilize accumulation. The insight is that the economy doesn't work in a vacuum. Whether you call it the economy or markets or capitalism, it doesn't work in a vacuum. It works in institutions, and that all the institutions act as a crucible to stabilize accumulation. But they themselves, as we've argued, are full of wriggly politics. And in the end, that crucible may fall into crisis. So the theory was originally designed to account for business cycles, but we can adapt it to look at the way in which these institutions work in an economy like India's. And Indian scholars have developed it in ways that the American version doesn't develop it, in that the social structure of accumulation is also a structure of discrimination, it's a structure of exploitation, and Alessandra Messaggeri just a month ago, it's a structure of social reproduction. Okay, so, sorry, at the bottom of the last slide, if this idea has any traction, it leads us towards a focus on the state, on a kind of paradox, the state beyond the limits of its own reach, either in theory, in law, or in practice. Okay, and it's there that I'm moving. So this is an image of activity in a small town. On the top right, you have money lending. The top center, you have the building regs, yes, the environmental standards for building. On the top left, you have power, electricity, and how it's regulated. On the middle left, you have waste, the economy as a waste producing system and how that is managed. And towards the bottom, you have child labor, you have attention to the labor force. And along the bottom are all the many ways in which property tax can be evaded. Okay, so about 10, 15 years ago, doing field work, I had this blinding revelation, which was that when I started out in 1972, if I had gone to a small shop in a market town, they probably weren't licensed, right? But now it's very different. So now all the firms are licensed with the municipality. Every firm has access because of Down. It has access to a bank account, and some of them have access to 10 and are constantly juggling. And they're juggling between bank loans and all kinds of webs of credit, which are unregulated in the so-called informal economy. So when I built my shop, the building inspector came and I gave him a gift and he went away. So I've used less metal in the concrete than I would have had to have done otherwise. So yes, I have electricity and it's metered and I pay for it, but I also draw electricity from the telegraph pole, from the electricity pole. I know nothing about the labour laws, nothing at all. If I need to employ somebody, I pay him what my uncle pays his labour. I know nothing about the environmental regs either. And at the end of the day, I get a little lady to sweep the mess out of my workshop into the road. Okay, not in Keller, but everywhere else. Sometimes the Civil Supplies Corporation asks me to put up price information. So I put up price information, but I don't do it regularly. And yes, I do pay tax. I pay professional tax, I pay property tax, but I only pay it at the end of the tax year and I don't pay it in full. And I do like making cash transactions because we don't have to declare them for GST. And this is my intuition, and this is the informal economy of the 21st century. And I hope it rings true with people in the audience. I want to run with it, because it generates this hypothesis that actually existing informality in the 21st century is the product of the selective enforcement of regulative law by the state and selective adherence and or compliance by me, by an economic agent in the economy. And the corollary, the secondary hypothesis, is that understanding exactly how this works will help us understand the character of Indian capitalism. So yes, I do belong to the school that says capitalism has character, as every business journalist also so does throughout the world. And the idea of character, incidentally, satisfies a condition for post-colonial studies, which I've also been looking at this year. So on to part two. Part two is an experiment with artificial intelligence. I asked AI 58 exploratory questions this summer. DeepSeek, Chinese. Yes. Actually, let's have a talk in Q&A. But the truth is that a 16-year-old daughter of the professor of AI at Wits Pinani put it on my laptop. So that's why I'm using this one. Yes, put it on in India when I couldn't put it on in the UK. Anyway, be that as it may, and one whole reaction may be, well, let's use another kind of AI and see what happens. Not in this lifetime for me, but other people. So I asked her 58 questions relative to this politics of selective regulation, and it spat out 93,000 words of response, complete with all the sources. On the other hand, if we add all the sources up, it only comes to 350. So compared with systematic reviews, which often deal with thousands of references, it seems to me that probably there isn't a lot of research about this. I didn't want AI to have a theoretical bias. It was very difficult. I also wanted to not to focus in a circular way on the informal economy. So what I did was stylize the Indian economy into big business and small family business, because I thought these terms are not theoretically loaded. They're pretty unspecific. And we know that the Indian economy is often bimodally stylized through size and cost structures and numbers. So both of those categories are heterogeneous: big businesses, family dynasties, private limited capital. But we are not looking at investment portfolios. We're looking at firms. And I've only just realized that big business actually technically covers public corporations as well, but I haven't looked at public corporations. Small family business is also very varied. It ranges from man with bicycles, petty commodity production, through small partnerships, And as I said before, about 95% of Indian firms are of this kind. AI proves to be sensitive to slightly different wording, and I did a lot of testing of results with slight variations in the questions. And AI is much better at factual outcomes rather than at relations and process questions. It's quite flaky, and it says the server is busy when it can't answer. Okay, so the questions, there were 7 families of questions. So as I told you, 58 questions totally. I asked about formal regulative laws. What are the most important regulative laws for big business and small family business? I then asked what the literature says are the laws that are most selectively enforced. So I got differences, which I'll explain. I then asked a question which blew my mind. Because of the duality and the importance of that binary approach in formality and informality, I never expected the result, and I'll show the result. I asked for the thresholds under which regulative laws do not operate. Then I asked questions about selective enforcement above and below the thresholds because of the result. And then I asked about state incentives for adherence, voluntary, and compliance feeling threatened, and social incentives, which it wasn't very good at. And finally, I asked about the state's vigilance institutions, because this was how the answers led me. So I could talk a lot about working with AI. I feel completely vindicated. It was like having a research assistant whom otherwise would have taken 2 years to produce the same result. So what I've done is create a working PowerPoint, which is like Henry James' loose baggy monster. And the slides here are not complete because I have to say all this in an hour, in less than an hour. Okay, so the first question, this is the way I've tabulated the answers. So it comes out in essay form with sources, and I've used judgment to tabulate the answers. So what we see from this is that the laws which are considered to be vitally important for big business are different to the set of laws which are vitally important for small family business. And there are very obvious differences between them in that the big business acts, the important ones, are to do with finance and tax, almost all to do with financial aspects of big business. And I also want to say that this whole exercise has been done at an India level, and that the complexity, once we start disaggregating to constituent states, is mind-boggling. I haven't gone there. And the regulative framework for small family business, for micro-industry, is much more to do with labour, eligibility for subsidies, for incentives, for grants, etc., etc. But they're a different set of laws. And of course, when we ask the question about selective regulation, we get both results. We get those laws which are selectively enforced are different from big business and small family business. It's not on this slide. And they are different from the full set. The third question, which is the one that blew my mind, is about the legally sanctioned thresholds of informality, because I just expected that these thresholds would be standard throughout regulative law, but they are not standard. Firstly, they differ enormously according to whether you're considering big business or small family business. Secondly, they differ internally within those categories. Thirdly, some of them are in money, in rupees, either assets or turnover, and some of them are in economic variables like labour, like whether I've been employed for more than 5 years on the right-hand column. So that's an economic variable, but not in rupees. And some of them, like packaging or type of activity for the Metrology Act, are not economic at all, but they're actually, the threshold is technological. So over and above the complexity of the threshold, so you're beginning to get a sense that the informal economy is not a kind of formal versus informal, but it's an incredibly complicated shoreline. Yes, a tidal shoreline. So we have to remember all the time that there are state variations, and Raghunathan, who's the spokesman for MSMEs, sorry, is always whinging about the fact that they're constantly being revised. So they're constantly unstable. And there are some laws which have no thresholds at all, just remember that. So for firms which are under all the thresholds, there must be a subset of firms which are under all the thresholds. And that is the informal economy of almost all the literature. Is state regulation a contradiction in terms? Why ask that question at all if they're under the threshold for all regulation? And so you ask AI, and what comes out is, no, not at all. There are some laws which have no thresholds. So there's no size which is not escaping regulation, at least in theory. And I've listed the laws, quite a lot of very basic laws, where there's no low threshold beyond which the state doesn't regulate. Then we get more or less punitive practice of law without thresholds. A lot of this law is delayed or blocked or careless. A lot is so complex, it's impossible to understand. And enforcement is sometimes done with harassment. And you might say, why does the state bother with these small units? But the state doesn't know that the units are small. The state just knows that there's a unit which probably isn't registered. So it happily harasses the firms which are under most of the thresholds. Okay. So I'm now skipping all the other questions that I asked in detail because I don't have time to lay them out today, but I do have the detailed workings. And what I'm going to move to now is the general conclusions that that exercise with AI led me to make. Firstly, many of the regulative laws are old. They're long, they were enacted long before the replacement of the so-called dirigist regime by the so-called neoliberal regulation. Many of them embody contradictory principles, or they're drafted with inoperable vagueness or strategic gaps, or they coexist with totally unrealistic data documentation requirements, and that the regulative frame, I put it in red bold, differs for different parts of the economy, stylized here as big business and small family business. That the regulative law that is most analysed as selectively enforced is a subset of the set of regulative laws, and it also differs for big business and small family business. That the legal thresholds under which firms are actually informal and unregulated vary. They vary across incommensurable dimensions, and some major laws have no threshold below which informality would prevail. That the relations of selective enforcement are system-wide and very complex, and they vary, even for the paradox of firms under the legal threshold in the unambiguously informal economy. So being under the threshold doesn't prevent the state from trying to regulate you. Now, what I haven't talked about at all is that the state sets in place incentives for both voluntary adherence and fearful compliance in the law. In many of the laws, legal drafters have anticipated the need to bring firms on board through incentives. And these also differ between big business and small family business. And you can see big businesses working through fiscal exemptions and fast tracking and penalties for non-compliance, and small family business working through credit and infrastructure and skills, and also threatening to withdraw social protection for non-compliance. And lastly, there are non-state social incentives. We've been talking about this earlier this afternoon, for both adherence and for compliance with actually existing regulated activity, and they differ for the two kinds of business in the informal economy. The state has a colossal variety. Maybe you all know this, but I didn't know this. Colossal variety of institutions of vigilance and inspection. It's not just the police and the Civil Supplies Corporation. Every department has vigilance. the institutions of vigilance themselves are hierarchized, regionalized, sectoralized, and in many cases, there are considerable differences across state frontiers in the capacity of vigilance forces in any given part of the economy, so that borders act as escape hatches, and cross-border activity has a really important evasive function. The people who run the vigilance system are often generalists. They're on deputation from other departments. Their service terms are not permanent, they're cyclical. There's colossal understaffing. I think this morning I talked about the Pollution Control Board. No, there's one Pollution Control Board official for a whole district in northern Tamil Nadu, and he doesn't have a vehicle. Okay, so that's not serious. That's throwing the Pollution Control Board into the hands of the people being scrutinized. And to my astonishment, most of the activity is devoted to vigilance inside the state sector at public sector corporations and units, and not at businesses in the market beyond. Okay, so that's what I learned from AI. Now what I want to do is turn to the lessons that fieldwork provides, which help us reading between the lines of fieldwork, which was actually carried out for other purposes. What it helps us understand about this very complicated shoreline between regulation and non-regulation. So to cut a long story short, in the loose baggy monster, the long version of this, there are 7 case studies and there will be 8. But here I'm only going to talk about 3: agriculture, gold, which is the gold of the book that's just come out, and coal. Because they each demonstrate something which I want to emphasize about learning about the process of informality. Okay. Now, most people dealing with agriculture breathe a huge sigh of relief and know that the agriculture sector is informal. Yes, we've all done this. I've certainly done it, and nobody's ever picked me up for doing it. Agriculture is informal. In this slide, we're looking at pesticides in the bottom right. We're looking at regulated market, bottom left. We're looking at electrifying the fields, top right. And we're looking at plots, land, top left. Okay, so the reality of agriculture is not that it's informal at all. And what I've done is a little bit different from how I described the small firm in the small town. I've looked at different kinds of regulation and how it maps onto agriculture. So some of agriculture is registered, not necessarily directly by the state, but the state could get hold of it if it really wanted it. Land is registered. Some credit is obviously registered by banks. Inputs are registered. Extension, certain amount of non-land activity. But when we actually go as researchers to get data about it, we often find that the documentation is flawed or it's just not available. Some sectors are heavily regulated. Chemical inputs, yes, except not in the field, not in the final use. Some aspects of agriculture are monitored for other uses, and the paradigmatic case is that electricity, which is metered, and from which can be calculated the amount of water that's being drawn for production. Other aspects of agriculture are not regulated or registered at all: tenancies, labour, all the non-bank credit, the livestock economy, which is colossal, some extension information, especially what's going on in mobile phones, and the use of common property resources. Never let us forget wasteland, so-called wasteland. Some is regulated, but only partially enforced, proliferating outside the records. And what I've all studied in agricultural markets, the commodity contracts, they're very poorly regulated, only partially, and certainly not in the categories of the APMC law, the regulated market law. And lastly, if we are looking at regulation, what we have to accept is that sometimes a given sector is regulated with laws which are predicated on opposite assumptions about how it works. And agricultural markets are a brilliant case in point because, excuse me, APMCs are tweaking the first transaction between the farmer and the trader. They're saying that basically the rest of the system is efficient. We don't have to monitor it, but we need to make sure that the farmer gets a decent, fair transaction, a contract with the trader. So the APMC Act specifies a form of governance and what constitutes open, competitive, accountable contract. However, the public distribution system is regulated on exactly the opposite sum, that markets are either unfair or they don't exist, and that the state must step in and directly control the distribution in the interest of the people who are victims or who don't have access to markets. So this is a prime, brilliant example of contradictory principles which work their way out in tense relations in practice, which is why the farmers' protest was so complicated. Okay, what do we learn from the study of gold, which is in the book which I've just given to CDS? This is a project which looks at gold from origin to destination and looks at every single stage of gold. I can't say more about it now than that, except that it teaches us a great deal about this zone of regulation. There's a whole global system. A lot of India's gold comes from Latin America, it comes from Ghana, it comes from East Africa. It's coming from Sudan right now via Dubai. And Dubai is practically part of India. It's essential to the gold economy. So there's inside the gold economy, you have everything from the moral economy of the household, that is my daughter, my bride, or the family relations which give rise to the transmission of gold across generations and between families at times of marriages and all kinds of times of the life cycle of the household. So you have a household moral economy coexisting with the informal craft economy, with the corporate sector, and with big criminal organizations. We can't just say this is white noise, this is anecdotal. They're actually bolted into the India's gold economy. And that inside the gold economy, criminal, semi-compliant, and compliant legal activity are balanced differently according to different stages and different places. The next thing we learn if we study gold is how difficult it is to study gold in isolation from anything else. So we often study, I used to be an expert on rice, and I got a job as an expert on rice. But it wasn't until I studied gold recently, I realized what we ignore if we're experts on something. So what we ignore is the fusion with other kinds of market and other kinds of distribution. So to the extent that gold is part of organized crime, which we know it is worldwide, it is also inseparable from drugs, armaments, capital flight, money laundering, illicit finance, and international seizures of land. Then gold can't be separated from its byproducts. Then gold is inseparable from various activities to privatize and commodify the state. Then gold can't be separated from informal credit. And lastly, gold, what goes on in the gold economy affects what goes on in other commodities. We have a lovely case study in the book of the silk economy in provincial India. And the same occurs that developments in regulation in these related sectors have an impact on the gold economy. So it's the mirror image of the point that I've just made. The structure of state regulation of gold is unstable. I mean, every time it's revised, it's forever and ever, but it goes on being revised in a way which is progressive. And there's a tension between trying to stop gold coming into India because it's regarded as a wasteful part of the economy. It's a huge part of the economy. And also trying to purify the quality and stop adulteration of gold. So there are tensions between quantitative and qualitative goals in policy and taxes and duties. And we must never, ever underestimate the importance of state ignorance of what's actually going on and incompetence in regulation. Okay, lastly, coal. I can deal with coal. You may be getting very tired, but I can deal with it fairly quickly, although the following slide is very, very dense, I'm warning you. The coal economy, and we could also characterize it as the economy of fire, goes all the way from child labor, as you can see in the bottom middle photograph, women in the informal economy burdened down with colossal headloads, the fortified bikes, which can carry half a ton in the coal syndicates, the purloining of state lorries and rakes of trains of Indian Railways to distribute illegal coal. And lastly, bottom right, the mafia. And there are 9 mafia houses in Jharkhand. We all know this. Now, the busy slide is not something that I'm going to talk you through. You'll be relieved to know. But what it does is look at every point from the Federal Ministry of Coal right through to labor unions in Jharkhand, every stage in the system of criminal illegal coal, and it shows just how state activity is meshed with the criminal economy of coal. And you can take what you like from this. It's systematic or it's system-wide. The transactions are interlocking the economy with politics and with the bureaucracy. So they're very firmly interlocked, right? And it produces a whole series of examples of this meshing of categories that we think about state and market firms, but in practice, they are intertwined in a system of entangled institutions in the coal economy. Okay, so this is the final part, probably relieved. What I'm going to do is, in the final part, firstly, think about what this means, what the case studies mean for the state, and secondly, what the case studies mean for the market, if you like. And finally, in the final 2 slides, some general wrapping up, some conclusions, and provisional speculations, which I hope may inspire some people in the audience to carry it forward or debunk it. What we find, first result, is that again and again, through both AI, but particularly through the case material, which was never designed to reveal this, is that violation seems empirically fundamental for exchange, for market economy. Now, this boxes me into a complete corner because what I knew about legal theory was the opposite, that the market economy requires a foundation of rule of law, right? So one big project, which I've just scratched the surface of, is the extent to which the opposite is true, or the extent to which both are true, depending on the school of legal interpretation. For a Marxist, and I'm only sort of on Thursday evening a Marxist, but for a Marxist, it's obvious that capital will break the law, that accumulation will break the law in every way possible in order to exploit labor, right? Because it's a fundamental principle. And if they get caught, they get caught. But basically, the law is superstructure. The structure of the economy is accumulate. But that's not the only kind of theory. There's an idea amongst some legal theorists that violation is foundational because otherwise you wouldn't have the law if you didn't have a concept of violation. But this is very much work in progress. I haven't got to the bottom of this by any manner of means, but it's a very big result. Then the variation in regulative scope, which I hope you've now appreciated, between different sectors of the economy, with plural regulative principles, unstable regulation, and lots of legal loopholes, means that discretionary behavior is pervasive, strategic, interstitial, discretionary behavior in the state. Just calling it corruption or bribery is really not getting at what's going on at all. That the state deliberately tolerates non-compliance, that the resources of the state are widely commodified. Michael Burawoy, alas, rest in peace, described it as primitive disaccumulation. It's often commodified, not through market means at all. David Harvey calls it accumulation by dispossession. In other words, various scholars are trying to figure out phrases which cover this kind of process. Then I haven't talked about this yet, but what's very obvious is that bureaucratic architecture is also fiendishly complicated. I think if we ever think of policy in spatial terms, we think about district or state or national policy. And we think about it territorially, right? But the moment we think about PWD or the Electricity Board, we start realizing that their jurisdiction is not territorial, it's networked. And so there are different kinds of networked jurisdictions, which are then superimposed on territorial jurisdictions. And all we can say about this is that it's a kind of foundational recipe for fragmenting markets as well as fragmenting bureaucratic power. Institutions, I've covered this before, which we theorize individually are hybridized. So there is emerging a new vocabulary. And with all emergent fields, there are lots of different words which are basically getting at the same thing. Hybrid state, graded informality, selective informality. This is not me, this is what the existing literature is calling it. And that the social relations across the regulative frontiers are a mix of compliance and partial compliance and criminal non-compliance, of ignorance, and of the preeminence of non-state regulative relations inside the state as well as outside. And that the demonstration effect at the top of the economy, what goes on in banking, what goes on in amongst the corporate oligarchy of India, exerts a demonstration effect, which I think is a barrier to reform. And all reforms, people ask constantly, how do you formalize this? Well, the answer is you can try and formalize this, but it will all pass through this mesh of institutions. For the market, rather than for the state, that these various kinds of regulation of capitalism, the market, private enterprise, whatever you like to call it, I'm not bothered with your theory, but they are not independent of each other. That it's very, very dangerous, actually, to focus on one particular sector and eliminate the derived markets or the interlinked or related or ramified markets that actually have a bearing on the behavior of the market that you're studying. Then accumulation itself, the main logic of the capitalist economy, is subject to plural values. And plural values, a whole set of values, are not outside capitalism, but they lead to stratified capitalism. The subset of the audience that we're talking this morning about caste, authority relations of caste, and more widely this afternoon of institutions, this is what I'm getting at. Each institution has a set of values that legitimate it. And it's not that that's outside the economy, that operates inside the economy. Let us never, ever forget the numerical significance of kinship, enterprise, self-employment. Actually, driving from Chennai airport to Pondicherry, as I did 5 weeks ago, I thought of the Tambaramization of India, and yesterday evening, the Tiruvananthapuratization of Kerala, because beside the road is mile upon mile upon mile of small shops. And some of those shops are now air-conditioned and have glass fronts and quite big buildings. And they're not petty in the way they were 50 years ago, but they are not big empires. They're not big federated corporate empires. They're family businesses. India is constituted through them. And people have called them many things: molecular, rhizomatic, amoebic, fragile. Surikesa has just published a paper where the average life is 8 years, or at least that's the average declared life. It's not that after 8 years the firm goes bankrupt, but they may take money and register it in something else. Okay, so we can't dismiss these firms as non-capitalist, subsistent, ancient. We can't say this is a need economy. This is actually part of India's capitalism. And as scholars, we need to understand how it's bolted into the capitalist economy and how it expands by multiplication of units, which all the statistics show for the 20th century, that it's done nothing but expand in numerical terms. So we have accumulation, we have Asim Premji, yes? And we also have this enormous expansion of tiny firms by numbers. Okay. Now for the general conclusions, I've almost finished. The hypothesis that informality expresses a politics of selective enforcement and selective compliance. That hypothesis is not rejected by this study of AI, using AI and using field evidence. And that the field evidence, the case studies, show process and relations in ways which AI does not do very well. But AI provides an enormous amount of granular factual detail. That at its very best, the informal economy is a fuzzy concept. It means it has multiple meanings and people understand it in different ways. That's the definition of a fuzzy concept. And it's also a compromised concept, and it's generative of scholarly disagreement. And if you take one thing back, it doesn't exist in a binary form in India's actually existing capitalist economy, despite the fact that this is how the data is published. The dualist models do little to help us understand it. And I don't know what to suggest. I hate neologisms because, but in this case, we need a new phrase: informal economic practices, perhaps, or non-state regulated economy, because that's more accurate, but certainly not unregulated, which is how most of the literature describes it. And ignoring it and residualizing it and at best binarizing it is actually a complicit technology of bureaucratic power and academic power. And it leads to policy processes which reproduce the very problems that the policies are apparently intended to address. Last main slide is about informality in the state. It isn't my conclusion, but it is the conclusion of people who study the Indian state as lawyers, that India's regulative order, the way India regulates the economy, is judged to be very complicated. It has loopholes, it has amendments. The ECA, the Essential Commodities Act, for instance, has been amended over 70 times. And it's said that there is no lawyer who actually understands the 70 amendments. The revisions are unstable and they are open to a range of legal interpretations. Now, after, 80 years of independence, we have to say that this is deliberate. This is not something that's just happened accidentally. It's systematic and it's deliberate. So it's not intended to be accessible to the people who are regulated. And this selective enforcement is serving a purpose. And the non-state regulated economy is not some kind of residual. It's also been created with intention. And this has huge implications for how we understand public policy and how we teach it. So this complicated bureaucratic order is made by state procedure. When I talk about law, I should have said this right at the outset. I'm also thinking about government orders and departmental procedure, all the things which are law-like rules through which the state regulates the economy. The Comoros have called it lawfare. And it's through these social practices and power relations that the informal state politics meets the politics of interests in the non-state regulated economy. So rule violation serves a purpose. Just as we know now that collective action is necessary for competition, violative behavior, both inside and outside the state, is vital for the effective operation of the non-state regulated economy. So the question that I'm left with, which I can't answer yet, is whose interest does this not serve? Who are the victims? Who is made vulnerable by this state of affairs? And I think there will be general answers and specific answers, depending on the kind of law that you're asking about. But what we can say right now is that legal scholarship seems to ignore the informal economy completely. Okay. How does it affect character? We have to look at the character of India's economy through the non-state regulated institutions. And I'm repeating things we've said already today in the discussion in the groups, that the non-state regulated economy has permanent roles for socially oppressive relations of authority through gender, through caste, ethnicity, religion, place, age, language, and you may know of other institutions. There's a new wave of Dalit scholarship, which is looking at intersectionality, which means the effect of the combination of institutions on the operation of the economy. And we know that policy diffuses through these non-state institutions, and so does technology. The moral units are local, not national, which has another set of implications for public policy. And that there are economic compulsions, both in the direction of differentiation in a classic Marxist way, or increasing inequality in the economy, and also to miniaturize, to perpetuate very small units of production, trade, finance, services, etc., etc. And this bimodality that I've operated with in the AI experiment is a heuristic simplification. It simply helps us to think about these manifestations. So what we have is growth in India by accumulation, concentration, centralization in the classical form, sitting beside network expansion or kinship enterprise expansion by multiplication. Okay, last slide. So there's a huge, huge agenda. If you don't think what I've just said is bunkum, there's an enormous agenda for research. The political economy of the relations of enforcement, which Prem Shankarjaya has called wormy dust. The wormy dust needs more research. The political economy of adherence, why I behave as though the law were being enforced, even if it's not being enforced. Yes? What gives me that incentive? The analysis, rather as I've tried to lay out today, but at the state level, which multiplies it by 28, or even more, if we're starting to look at cross-border frontiers of regulation, and the mirror project for the socially regulated equivalence, which I started in the book I published in 2003 called India Working, but which really needs to be revised and made relevant to this set of problems. Okay, and last but not least, there are implications for how we know what we know, for method, for knowledge, because I don't know how you push this agenda forward other than through primary fieldwork. So AI is definitely meeting its limits. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Barbara Harris, for that very thought-provoking and presentation. It raises a number of interesting issues as well as hypotheses and sets agenda for future research. A number of issues, new issues, which many of those things are not discussed earlier. Some new framework for understanding informality So I think a lot of ideas for researchers. So thank you so much for raising those very important issues. Started with the theorization of informality, and then looked at more empirical issues, binaries, various binaries, and also other role of institutions, non-state regulation as well as state regulations, how it affects informality. So it looked at various issues and the political economy of regulation. Like I find it really very interesting to say that India's regulation is very complex, as her presentation shows. The AI supports the same thing. Yeah. Because that kind of response that got from the AI really shows the complexity. But the interesting point which I get from her is that this regulation is purposeful. There is intentional. The complexity of the regulation is intentional. So there are reasons why it is remaining complex. So so at one level we all argue for reforms, right? We want to make things simplified, less regulation, so that you improve efficiency of economic units, including small firms, large firms, etc. But at the same time, there is powerful political economy forces that likes the status quo. There are gains from complexities. Particularly, we can see that bureaucracy gains a lot from complex regulations, because that's where the bureaucratic power comes. Now, if the regulations are simple, transparent, then bureaucracy cannot exercise its discretion. But here, if you make it purposefully complex, then you enjoy a lot of discretionary power. And when you enjoy that power, then it leads to naturally rent seeking, corruption, lobbies, all these come into the picture. So what we see in the informal economy today in India is the result of all that. So there is a very powerful political economic forces which is operating, which comes out very clearly from her presentation. And I'm sure that there are a lot of questions that would come up. Professor Kannan is here, who is an expert in informal sector. And so Professor Premachandra Tukarala, who has that international experience about particularly countries in Asia, how the enterprises operate there. So I think there are others also, Professor Murdulipan, who has worked in this area. Particularly, this feminization issue is also related about the regulation, some of this issue, feminization of labor force. And she has worked on that. I think many such issues will come up. So I'll now open it for the floor to raise questions or comments. And of course, a lot of our students are very much interested in this topic. Many of them are working. Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah, come. Yeah. There's mic, right? Say mic.
Thank you very much. And I enjoyed the lecture very much. It was full of facts, and I had to take more time to think about issues carefully. But I have a question and a comment. The question is that in a nutshell, if I sum up your entire presentation, what you say is that informality is basically embedded in the regulatory economy.
Yeah.
Right? Or in other words, complicated bureaucratic procedures nurture informality and related inefficiency. Is this inference different from what the rent-seeking literature has been telling for a long time, including Anne Kruger's seminal paper and her PhD thesis based on fieldwork in India, come up with basically the same inference. Maybe this reflects my ignorance, but I would like to get your opinion. The second point or committee's suggestion, now there is a new literature coming up on curse of money, right? Curse of Money. Kenneth Rogoff wrote a very important book 3 years ago, and he clearly he has data to suggest that in many countries, informal sector, in a way formal, which is basically nurtured by the use of currency big notes. He talked about the drug cartels and in Chinese corruption practices, bribery and everything. Then he says, when the economy shifts from curse of money situation to use in electronic payment media, the informal sector will shrink in most of the countries, right? Informality is nurtured by the ability to use big currency notes, basically. Then when the currency notes disappeared, perhaps it would have happened even in India to some extent, right? I think it's a very interesting research issue, but yeah, thank you.
Barbara, I'm not here to ask questions. I have to go and I seek your permission because for my own reasons to be back home early.
Right.
But I want to say a couple of things. We know each other for quite some time, and I'm astounded how much work that Barbara does at this age and with so many people as collaborators. And we know that, and some of the names are very names that we know each other, and I'm quite astounded. Secondly, what I have got from her books and literature is that each subject or question that she asks, she goes into the most difficult, complex nuances of that subject. And her book on the Tamil Nadu mercantile capitalism and the rural capitalist economy that bears testimony to this, and many other. And I have not read the Gold Book, but I'm sure it also carries that stamp. But I will throw a few questions, Barbara, if you like. I don't want to get the answers right now because I'm going, but we will discuss it later or when your paper is ready. The first question is the literature search. Of course, it is conditioned upon how the questioner asks questions to the AI.
Yes.
So that's very important. So you still have to, you can't leave everything to the AI. You need your own AI to frame questions. So I was thinking and sitting here and wishing if only I had an AI chip here, I could have absorbed all these things so quickly. I found it very difficult to digest and how many nuanced answers the AI gives. So I remain skeptical of I am not against AI, of relying, or how much can we rely, and put it that way, on AI. The second thing is the word informality is the product of Keith Hart.
Yes.
And when a white man says and classifies something, then it becomes international vocabulary. And I know for sure in ILO, they took it up and gulped it down and called formal and informal. So a whole lot of literature grew out of that. When we in the commission, our own limited experience, when we looked at all this literature, and then we found that it is not the registration criterion, it's not the taxation criterion, it's not the employment criterion that matters when you look at informality. It is insecurity. Underlying informality is not the label that you give. Their sense of informality in economics, in the labor market literature, is insecurity. You are not secure as a worker in terms of employment security or social security. That brings me why my friend Barbara has not referred to. There is another binary. Are you referring to informal enterprises?
Yes.
Or are you referring to informal workers? We were very clear in the commission that these are two. There is an overlapping space where informal sector and informal work combines in the self-employment category. As street vendors, as rickshaw pullers, all kinds of things. I am the employer, I am the worker, I am the enterprise, I am the worker. Isn't it? But beyond that space, there is a distinction between enterprises and this thing. And secondly, why didn't you ask questions based on the idea of insecurity and not the formal status, whether you are registered or tax paying and all that? The third question that I ask myself is that, is this generalizable to other developing countries? In my limited knowledge says yes, of course. But my cupid mind also asks the question, can I generalize it to the rich countries?
Possibly.
Huh?
It's an empirical question, yes.
Okay, you have some sympathy with my question. But I also realize that in a globalized capitalist system, the rich countries were successful in encouraging the existence of informal sector and informal workers through what they call supply chains. So you do the dirty work in Tirupur, $1 per t-shirt. You go to a London shop or Amsterdam, which I have done, and you find the price tag or was $25 or 25 euro. So you know the difference. So the much of the super profits of the globalized multinationals located in the OECD countries, especially in America and in Europe, is conditional upon the existence of a vast reservoir of insecure workers and insecure enterprises in Tirupur, in Sri Lankan economic zones, or in Colombia, or in DeSoto's slums in Peru, and all sorts of countries. So what I missed in your presentation is the connection with the globalized economy. It sounds as if it's all India. The political map of India is the universe of discourse.
Yeah.
Of course, you just cross the border to Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nepal, Myanmar, doesn't make any difference. And even to Africa and Latin America. But I want to erase that border lines right up to London, Frankfurt, and New York, where the international capital system's motors are working. Without that motor working, it would be very difficult to generate this kind of complex situations and relationships of reproduction of informality and insecurity. I'm sorry, I may have put out too many questions, but I really like your bold attempt in opening up this subject to a different perspective and a much wider space. And she's essentially also a social anthropologist, or started as a social anthropologist, then development economics, political economy, political sociology, and I don't know then now how to, just like informality, I can't define you. But thank you so much for this wonderful presentation to a very highly intelligent youngsters here, and I'm sure they will take up some of these challenges. Thank you, Barbara. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah.
Um, I also thought it was very interesting, but I was missing this, that the human element in the whole thing. I mean, the informal really is to do with capital labor relations, with the low wage, that sort of a thing. It didn't come out at all. I mean, we were talking mostly of laws, and very rightly so, that it's a spectrum. The whole economy, in a way, is a spectrum of it. And all these laws, some have adherence to more of them, compliance of more of them, but some don't. And so you become more informal. So that sort of a thing, you brought it out very well. And what I was just wondering about was that, the old concept of the informal and formal binary is all out now. Since Marta Chen's work, actually, one started realizing that even the formal sector is informalized to a large extent. The informal sector is also a spectrum. There's so many informalities within the informal sector. So there's nothing new that we were discussing. I thought that we know that the formal, there's no longer a binary like that. That's what I was thinking first. But you've made it very the perspective you have brought into it is, of course, the whole issue of how laws can actually make a difference. But somehow I thought we are so worried about the poor at the bottom, that one didn't get the idea of what's happening to them. I mean, what sort of informal or what sort of formal practices can be brought about to, or what sort of law can be made operable to them to able to bring them up. And of course, the women are in the picture now because you can pay them less. That's very clear. The whole feminization that we talk about is because we can pay them much less than. So a bit of more of a human touch to the whole thing, I thought. And also the same question I wanted to ask, why did you go in for AI? I mean, why was it so necessary to go in for an AI review of literature? Is that a done thing now? Is it that one always goes into that? Or your fieldwork is there, of course, to sort of correct the thing. But well, yeah, these are the sorts of things I had in mind.
So there you go.
Thank you very much for this. Your work on criminal economies has been very useful to me personally to explain the breakdown of local government, local self-government in some panchayats in Kerala. I find, I just wanted to ask you this question as a historian. As you were speaking, many things that you said struck me as actually, dating far back into the pre-independence period. Many of those, including the exclusion of units with less than 10 workers. And also I was just thinking this, whether it's in India or in China, as we know, the Opium Wars, and in India, the whole history of the entry of the East India Company into Bengal, both the very important things that happened that facilitated that entry were the violations. Basically, both the Nawab of Bengal as well as the Emperor of China, the bureaucrats of these potentates, they were attempting to stop the British, and in China, of course, more colonial powers, from actually violating their regulations. And as you rightly mentioned, tax was the most important of them, as well as free passes, etc. So I was just thinking, how much of this is actually related to, a colonial legacy, which India has just failed to correct. That could be one thing. That's one thing I wanted to ask. There's a lot that you've said, I think, which one could, it's a lot to process. So one might take more time, but this is what I essentially want to ask about the angle of time and history, and how much of it is, what I wanted to really also want to add is about the social part of what you were saying. The way you I think that is very, very illuminating. How social institutions, kind of transition and start actually take on economic functions. Again, remember that's a very old legacy. So how has really Because, if you look at, say, work by President Parthasarathi and others, they point out how guilds, there were corporates of weavers, etc., who deal directly with the state. And so information traveled through the weaver community very fast because they had these institutions, etc. And that was broken down when the East India Company entered the scene. So, what are your thoughts on those? I would be interested. Thanks.
We can respond to some of this and then come back.
Thank you very much for really penetrating and difficult questions. I'm not sure how well I can answer them. The first question was about, well, there were several. I probably won't answer all, but I'm not trying to evade them. Can it be boiled down to rent seeking, what I'm describing? And it's not just Anne Kruger, Robert Wade, Market for Office in early 1980s. Can rent seeking account for the really big differences between different regulative acts? There's no ultimate God waving a magic wand over and saying, look, we're going to have more complexity here and less here because these are niches for rent seeking. So it may be operating. I wouldn't want to contest that, but whether it's the principle, I would contest. And yeah, our policies deliberately designed to enable rent seeking, I very much doubt. It may be a factor because who designs policy? Yeah, policies are drafted by lawyers. Is it the lawyers who create the opportunities for rent seeking? Is it the magistrates who are on secondment to the Justice Department who scrutinize the laws before they're debated in the Legislative Assembly or in Parliament? I mean, officially, there are various interests at play. And so a theory of rent seeking would have to somehow manage to reconcile the different interests in the drafting of a law and then at play in the operationalizing of a law and then explain all this variety. So the answer is yes and no, but thank you for the question. I didn't get the curse of money. I think my attention must have lapsed, but the idea is that the informal economy is disincentivized if large notes are withdrawn or small notes.
Yeah.
That it's a cash economy and it depends on large notes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know whether demonetization is a living experiment, but it hasn't stopped the informal economy.
No, even but we use in electronic payment. Yeah, I don't know.
We perhaps need to talk about that afterwards. Cannon isn't here, but his questions are really important. I'm not claiming a general theory. I'm reporting an exercise. Cannon is very skeptical, and other members of the audience are skeptical about AI. I have used it to fast track what could have been a human research assistant. But if it had been a human research assistant, it would have been subject to human error. Now, you may say AI is subject to AI error, but we're not error-proof. I'm not claiming that AI is infallible. It's an experiment. And I was able to get in a week what a research assistant would take a year or two. I don't have a budget. I'm deeply retired. I have no research assistant. So it's, for me, it was a fabulous research assistant. And at the end of the day, I used to say, thank you, as though it was alive. because it was like having a conversation with a human being. But anyway, the speed with which I think I have a clear conscience. If you're asking it for factual information and you're asking a kind of AI that provides the source and gives the result, it's simply a very fast research assistant, right? With all the problems of a research assistant. What Panan said about insecurity, what he said about the South, what he and you said about Labour, I accept. I was looking at the informal economy as a system of firms, as is very obvious, big business and small family business. The small family business question does give rise to quite a lot of information about labour law, but the social case study information about social relations of oppression and the most the role of caste as well as class and gender in the oppression of labour, I can do from the work that I've done on waste, but I haven't incorporated it yet. It's a question of drawing a line around it for the perspective of being rather desperate for feedback. And I'm very grateful for the feedback that I have. Expanding it to the complicity of advanced countries in the drafting of law, that I don't believe. Well, maybe KPMG is drafting law now, and McKinsey is yes, it's drafting law for the government of India or even Kerala government. They are, but to what extent that actually is done in a way which is complicit with the interests of Wall Street or the City of London is an open question for me, but that's certainly some very, very interesting possibility. No, I'm saying that.
You said that India might be drafting a law for Kerala government.
I said I don't know, but I know that KPMG is definitely drafting law in India. The critique that I lack the human element I take. Right now, I haven't done a labourist analysis. It would be another project. So I'm looking at the regulation of firms in the economy, because that's how the concept of informality started out, the range of dual theories. So yes, I haven't looked at poverty. I haven't looked at a lot of things, and I may not ever do that, but other people are very welcome to take the project on into the future. Question about history is a very interesting one, because it's very obvious that some of the Factories Acts from Karuna's work, I know, and certainly the Companies Act, well, the Factories Act is well before independence and the Companies Act is 19th century. So yes, there are colonial roots, but both those acts have been massively amended in independent India, and the Labour Acts were revised. So there's another question which nobody has raised, but you hinted at, which is the need to reform these overcomplicated laws, which nobody can understand. So one practical implication of this study is the reform of law. The Essential Commodities Act is crying out for it. Now, the labour laws were reformed in 2020, weren't they? But I think they're still very controversial. I'm not sure they've gone through Parliament, but that is an attempt to cut through this complexity and to rationalise it. GST is another case. Yes, GST in 2017 was an attempt to rationalise GST. It hasn't rationalised GST, but that's what was the apparent purpose behind it. So there is a process of legal reform, which is looking at these laws which have long, long historical roots and saying how relevant are they in their multiply amended complex form for India in the 21st century. So that is happening. But I think my point will be that it will always have to filter through this mesh of state institutions and capacity and non-state institutions. The other thing that your question provoked was a differentiation between force and violation, and that your story of the East India Company was a story of force. And of course, some violation of law does involve force, but a lot of it doesn't involve force. So we have to distinguish between all kinds of avoidance and evasion, which does not require physical force, and the kinds of historical process that took place 250 years ago. And I take the point about guilds being old. But calling them guilds, what the institutions that regulate the informal economy now, or the non-state regulated economy, chambers of commerce, in the 1 lakh town I've been studying for 45 years, 67 associations, some of which are very obviously grounded in caste, not exclusive anymore because they're business associations. But very few people take them seriously. Very few people, especially economists, pay any attention to them at all. But they have a huge, huge role in ordering the economy. So many of them are new. We studied the 67 in this town in Tamil Nadu in the late 1990s, and a good majority were set up in the previous 15 years. So they're new, but they take that ancient form of guilds. So thank you very much for that comment as well.
Yeah. Her hand up to that.
Thank you for that really, vast kind of lecture from which I was actually struck by the parallels with with the area that I work on, which is emigration and the migration of poorly educated women to the Middle East.
Yes.
So I could see very clearly how how regulation really works in their experience. So it's very, very true that everybody is a stakeholder in this. And therefore, the purpose of that regulation clearly, I mean, even women who are going through irregular channels have a stake in that. But I would think a key question really to ask is about the distribution of risk.
Oh.
And that's, it's inverse because you benefit the least and you have the highest risk.
Yes.
So that I think is one issue that I want to point to here. The other is something that you did not get involved in, but I could see it in the work that I do on emigration. And that is that there seems to be a rhetorical aspect of regulation as well. Yes, by which I mean a persuasive an effort to speak to certain constituencies, or regulation is speaking to multiple constituencies. So when you are placing restrictions on the migration of poorly educated women, poor women, you are actually speaking to the public, the educated public, and saying, see, we've done our job. We've stopped them from going. We've protected the honor of the nation. And you're not really speaking to the interests of the women who are going by actually trying to make migration safe and regular and all of that, which is also part of the rhetoric of this whole thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Barbara. I just wanted to ask about one point that you had on your presentation, that legal scholarship has ignored informal work, informal economy. Legal scholarship has ignored
Legal scholarship.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was just thinking about what would you say about how legal framework excludes certain informal work, for example, domestic workers. So there has been a history of excluding domestic workers from some
Yes.
from the regulatory framework, which again maybe linked to the insecurity part of it.
You're
So
right.
how will you look at informality from the exclusion?
Good question.
Questions? Yeah.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Balachandar. I'm a first year PhD scholar. My question is related with social issue, which is related to Indian capitalist market. My question is, I know you are familiar with caste system in India. Caste system in India, the privileged caste groups control most top jobs in companies, government offices, courts, and 90% of Indians has little presence. Think implementation of reservation in private sector is possible for socially disadvantaged communities. And the second question, do you think uh, economic independence of socially disadvantaged communities achieve social justice? Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. So, just few thoughts about trying to connect what you have explained with some of the macro level issues pertaining to the Indian economy. Particularly, it's a idiosyncratic type of structural transformation, which many people talk about. That India opened up, it liberalized in 1991, hoping that we will, we will experience a particular type of growth process, which will be more employment generating because India being a labor abundant country, having comparative advantage in labor intensive manufacturing, would benefit the abundant factor of production, which is labor. But manufacturing sector's share in Indian economy is stuck at very low level. So we couldn't replicate the Chinese type of a growth experience, which is driven by manufacturing. And we have experienced a very idiosyncratic type of growth where the knowledge intensive or skill intensive services and skill intensive manufacturing were the driving force of growth. And I think the complexities of regulations that you highlight play an important role in explaining that larger story. The other thing, which is also related to other big story about India's growth process, is what many people talk about, the missing middle. If you look at the distribution of firm in terms of their size, and look at the distribution of manufacturing firms in India, and if you compare that with the East Asian countries, China or other East Asian countries, we see that there are practically no large firms in India in manufacturing, right? So almost 90% of manufacturing output is coming from very tiny firms, which is very different from what is there in other countries. So as you said, there is a strong incentive to stay small. And that happens mainly because these regulations that you are talking about, most of them are size dependent. So it's like a new regulation come into the picture when you cross a particular size threshold. So there are evidence which shows that there is bunching of firms at particular size threshold. Like, there are a lot of firms that are concentrated at threshold level of, let's say, 10. Then another set of firms which are concentrated at the threshold level of 20, then 50, then 100.
Yeah.
So what you are saying at a very micro level and a case study based evidence is very much consistent with the kind of macro picture that we are observing. So this shows like, how do we go about reforming this? Unless we do this, the kind of inclusive growth that we are talking about will not happen. The other question, this is more about, it's very interesting that when you say that there is a selective enforcement of regulation by state and selective compliance. Now, I would like to know, like, is there a motivating factor behind it? Like, what is driving this selective enforcement of regulation? What is the political economic factor behind it? So can you provide more explanation why it is so, and what is really driving it? And the other interesting point that you make is the violation of regulation is foundational for, exchange. Now, that is also very counterintuitive.
Yes.
Right? We generally believe that for an economy to flourish, you have to follow regulation. But what she's saying, interestingly, is that violation is foundational. right? That's also very interesting. I know it would be great if you can explain, why violation of regulation is fundamental for this exchange or these enterprises to grow. So that is counterintuitive because we generally expect if you follow regulation, you grow. So that's interesting. So yeah. So
Maybe can I respond?
Yes.
I'm fading. I think I would like to respond in reverse order. So I think your first point was the question whether the failure structurally to transform is to do with complexity of regulation of manufacturing. I can't answer that question. But AI could. But anyway, it's a very good sort of nuanced next stage of question to ask. But when I was last involved with growth, which is a long time ago, we did a project with a CGE model of the economy and fieldwork, trade liberalization in India's informal economy. It wasn't skill and knowledge and the service economy that was actually driving growth. It was the informal economy. So that is a cross-cutting classification. So not as though the formal big service, services is a dustbin. It has everything in it from back office servicing and IT to domestic labor. But so we classified it differently, but we can't ignore the driver of the informal economy and not just skill and knowledge. And we do have to reckon that skill and knowledge is class stratified also, that it's a driver of the economy that is prejudiced against practical engineering manual work, and that may be needed in order to expand manufacturing. The missing middle, yes, is very, it's not just good to think about, that it's a fact out there that in many sectors there is no middle. And that's another reason why I'm prepared to, to model or to simplify growth in two different ways. Profit and investment accumulation, a trajectory which is the normal one in textbooks, whether it's left textbooks or right textbooks. But then this one which economics has very little vocabulary for, which is your tiny family business or all the shops that are lining the road between here and where I'm staying, which is expanding by multiplication of units. Now, you talked about the incentive to stay small, but there are also inbuilt incentives inside a small household. There's a limit to how much the patriarch can manage. Okay, so he marries his daughter off, and with that goes a dowry, and that goes not just on a motorbike, but that goes on a shop, that goes on some working capital for the son-in-law. That's how it expands, or partnerships, or dividing property on inheritance. So there are sociological constraints which actually work in the same direction as wanting to remain small to evade tax and regulation. So it's overdetermined. I take the point about the political economy of state enforcement. That requires fieldwork inside the state. That's very difficult to do. And I can't do it, but you can do it. And yes, this whole idea of violation being foundational for exchange is a big conundrum, but I do know enough about legal interpretations to know there are many schools of interpretation. And for one or two of them, notably Marxists, it's not a problem. It's because the capitalist is quite unscrupulous. They can get away with breaking the law, they do. Yeah. The question, sorry. the parallels with migration. That's so fascinating. And I hadn't thought about that, but it's equivalent to your point about labor and my lack of the human part of the economy in this research so far. And the fact that the way in which regulations are implemented is a way of distributing risk and vulnerability is a point I take very well. It's a really useful observation, which is coming out of migration, but probably is relevant in other parts of the economy. So thank you very much. And the idea that regulation is actually part of political rhetoric. Yes, we see this with climate change in the West. My God, it's such a lot of rhetorical greenwashing. Yes, and only in your case, the victimization is real. And in our case, the victimization is global and quite abstract. The question about legal, I forget who asked it, but this was a very good question about, I said that legal scholarship avoids the informal economy. And the question was, well, it doesn't, because it quite deliberately does exclude. And it's true, Karina Dietrich-Wielenger's history of the Factories Act shows that the employers deliberately wanted a wide range of a very high, low threshold for inclusion under the Factories Act, because they had large labour forces and they wanted to be able to screw those labour forces. So the point is very well taken. Cast in state corporations, that's reservations. There was a question at the back about reservations and reservations in the private sector. Given what we know about what you said, the control over the private sector by caste elites, if reservation was ever accepted, it will be accepted at a rhetorical level. And I think it will be extremely difficult to push through, however desirable it might seem in theory, right? And does reservation bring social justice? Well, it certainly helps social justice, but reservation by itself can't ensure social justice. Social justice requires the transformation of society. And I have learned enough from young Dalit student colleagues that this will only happen if caste is abolished. And that is not going to happen.
Okay, so thank you so much. It's a very interesting lecture and discussion. Thank you so much for coming and delivering this.
Yes.